Hi, good morning. My name is John Cohen. I graduated from Connecticut College in 1983. And the idea I'd like to discuss with all of you today is that everyone in this room, whether you're a parent or whether you're a student, has the ability through your life to impact the lives of others, impact the lives of people living in communities across the country, and has the ability to shape what nations do. So I'd like to discuss that idea through a description of the journey I took. A journey that began in many respects here in New London, a journey that includes, like others, a beginning, a time of adventure, a period of self-realization, and at some point, coming to peace with where I was and being able to take the journey to its later stages. So by way of introduction, today, I currently serve as a senior official in the United States government. I have been the acting undersecretary for intelligence at the Department of Homeland Security. And I also have, for several years, run the department's counterterrorism activities. I'm one of a few people who, within the federal government, track every single threat facing the United States each and every day and come up with actions in order to protect the people of this nation from being the targets of those attacks. I would say that my journey to this current position was not a regular journey. In fact, it was one of challenges. It was one of misdirection. It was one that was certainly atypical. And it was one that all along the way, people failed to believe that I would finish this journey in a productive and in the way that it finished today. I, like many of you, when I went through my college career, had no idea what I wanted to do. And so I'm here to tell you that no matter how fearful you may be or how lack of knowledgeable you may be about the future, you will achieve something. You will achieve something as long as you listen to your inner voice, you follow your passions, and you follow your dreams. So let me talk a little bit about my journey. As I said, it began here at Connecticut College. And my journey was really fueled by two sets of activities, or two sets of beliefs. One, in many respects, my journey was informed by my fears and my desires to conquer demons that were inside of me. I grew up, like many of you, reading the great literature of our time. Reading is fundamental. I read the stories of Achilles and Hector and Pericles. I read history of the United States and the European nations. I learned about people who put sense of duty and sense of honor before all else. And I often asked myself, as I was growing up, and particularly while I was here at Connecticut College, how would I respond if I was faced with mortal danger? How would I respond if I had to put the good of the people against the good of myself? How would I respond if I went into a situation and felt incredible, paralyzing fear? And in many ways, many of the things I did through my life, through my entire journey, was based on my trying to seek answers with those questions. Now, arguably, those of you who may have known me when I was here would argue that I probably didn't do it in the most productive way. There was an incident jumping out of the JA windows into some bushes that probably wasn't that productive. But in any event, part of my journey was informed by me seeking the answers to those questions. The other part of my journey actually really didn't come to clarity until just a few days ago, as I was preparing to return to the place where my journey began, here in Connecticut College. Now, I debated within my mind whether I should come here and talk to you about the journey of this nation since September 11th and talk about the international threat of terrorism and how this nation has wandered with its partners around the world to deal with the troubles of our time. But I decided that because so much of what I think it will be beneficial to you has to do with my own personal journey through these times. But my journey began here at Conn. I didn't follow the path that one would imagine. I wasn't a government major. I actually majored in American history. I chose American history because classes were on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I felt like I didn't want to have classes on Mondays and Fridays. My area of focus was the role of women in American history. Part of that was because my advisor was studying that area, and she had a great passion for it. Second was, I thought it would be a great way to meet women. Which I did, but they were all angry at me. I, like many of you, entered my senior year not knowing where I would go. I read a book, a great work of literature, called The Day of the Jackal. Really wasn't a great work of literature, but it was very exciting, and it was about Carlos the Jackal, who was the great terrorist of the 70s and 80s, most prolific terrorist. And I said to myself and my friends over at the Bar and Crow, I'm going to catch him. I'm going to catch Carlos the Jackal. And they looked at me like I was crazy, and then we continued with the evening's entertainment. So I sought to join the CIA, I sought to join the NSA, but at the time we were still embroiled in the Cold War. We were still focused on the Soviet Union. In order to enter the intelligence community, you had to have studied Russian, been a Russian history major, you had to have language skills, none of which I had. So I became a federal agent, working crime for the Department of Defense, criminal investigations for the Department of Defense. I remember when I picked up the phone and called the Dean of Student Affairs, because this was several months after I graduated, to inform her where I'd been hired and where I was going to work, I was met with silence. And she basically finally said, "They hired you?" I think she was expecting me to be calling her to say that I was in custody in the jail in downtown New London. So I spent a few years in Long Beach, California, working as a federal agent, working cases associated with national security, and then I began to work with local police on undercover investigations. And as I said last time I was up here on campus, I was really good at doing undercover investigations. Undercover drug deals, buying stolen property, solving murders. But I also found that local police were making a lot more money than federal agents were. So I went the reverse direction. I went from being a federal agent to being a local police officer. Another time in my life where I was met with concern and question by my family and peers. Some thought there was something wrong with me. Many could not fathom why an upper middle class kid from New England who went to prep school growing up and a college like Connecticut College would go become a street police officer in Los Angeles, California. But off I went. And it was one of the great experiences of my life because it was a life filled with adventure. It was a life filled with confrontation of life and death situations on a daily basis. I was in shootouts. I worked patrol. I worked on the SWAT team. I worked undercover. I negotiated multi-thousand kilo drug deals. It was a time of great adventure. It was a time of clarity in many respects. It was good versus evil, right versus wrong, black versus white. Not racially, but concrete versus obtuse. But I left that experience, or I formed through that experience, a number of questions. Questions such as, why, when we were policing communities, did we treat members of that community like they were suspects? Why did we not understand more about the communities we were serving? I remember one time I was on patrol and a car in front of me crashed into a tree. Turned out that the individual who crashed the car had just stolen the car. He had just gotten out of state prison that day. So I jumped out of my police car and he ran, and I started running, chasing him, jumping over block walls. I finally arrested him, and in this community, depressed community of South Central LA, people came out of their houses and started applauding. So I put the suspect in the car, and I was trying to catch my breath, and several of the people living in the community came up to me and talked to me about how happy they were that the police were there and how it made them feel safe. And then I'll never forget this. There was a woman who walked up to me and told me how her children couldn't play in their front yard, how they had to sleep in either the closet or the bathtub for fear of gunfire coming through the walls. And it made me understand that all too often, when we are in positions of protecting security and protecting the people who live here or protecting our neighbors, we forget that the people we are protecting are people too. We sometimes ascribe the physical and psychological makeup of the suspect on the very people we're seeking to protect. We sometimes forget that in protecting our communities, we also have to protect privacy and liberties of those communities. And if we forget that lesson, we've forgotten the most important lesson of all. So I went seeking more clarity for these questions that I had, and I went back to school. I went to graduate school. I wanted to study international affairs. I wanted to study how transnational crime and terrorism would impact the national security of the United States, and how police and law enforcement around the world would need to restructure themselves post-Cold War so that they would be better able to confront these non-nation state threats. So I went to USC while I was a police officer. I began studying, was supported by a number of the professors there. So they encouraged me to write a big paper, as they called it, which I did, about the topic I just described. And they asked me to present it at an academic conference. I was very excited. Here was a guy who was a street cop, somebody who never thought about going to graduate school, who had written this paper about international law enforcement regimes and the role of third parties. And I was going to present it to academics, and they would look at me and they'd say, God, you really get it. So I present, you know where this is going, right? So I presented the paper. I concluded my remarks. I looked into the crowd, and I was met with stares. No noise, no applause. It was sort of like the piece we saw right before I started, the 1.5 minute silence. Finally, one of the academics in the audience stood up and said, how dare you come to a group of academics and suggest that terrorism would ever be a top-tier national security issue worthy of academic study? This was 1991. I was right. So I left Los Angeles in 1991 and moved temporarily to Washington, where I still am. I had a number of jobs. I worked on Capitol Hill, where I ran investigations for the House Judiciary Committee. I worked in the White House, the Executive Office of the President, where I advised a member of the President's cabinet on law enforcement and national security issues. I left government, worked for a major telecommunications company. Then I started my own company, started 2 companies actually. And in 2001, on September 11th, my life, like everyone else's life, changed. And what was interesting about the journey that I just described through all of these other jobs, I always seemed to gravitate to projects or initiatives that involved me going back into communities and figuring out ways to make government more productive and government more responsive to the needs of people. I never really could understand why. Whether it was the creation of a national non-emergency number when I worked at AT&T, whether it was work I did on transnational drug trafficking and the impact local police have on stopping transnational crime, or whether it was the threat of economic espionage to US corporations, I always sort of gravitated back to my roots, working with communities, working with community members, working at the local level. After September 11th, I essentially became a mercenary Homeland Security advisor. I worked for governors and mayors around the country, helping them think through how to incorporate Homeland Security into that which they do every day. And in a way, my personal journey became intertwined with the nation's journey. Because as we have sought to deal with the terrorist threat facing this country post 9/11, where we have come out is that it begins with local communities. It begins with hometown security. If local police and local communities can't work together to protect themselves from violence within those communities, we will never be able to protect this nation as a whole. So much of my time over the last several years has been spent working with local leaders, working with mayors and governors, working with leaders of foreign countries, working with the president and his cabinet, working with others in the FBI and the intelligence community. And we've all come together and focused on building capabilities at the local level, ensuring that local police have trusting and respectful relationships with community members, that we're integrating mental health services, educational services, faith communities in a holistic way so that we're better able to and better prepared deal with violence that may face our communities, including violence that may be related to terrorism. So it's been a very indirect journey, and it's been a journey filled with many challenges, both personal and professional. But I'd like to leave you with a few thoughts. New York Times bestselling author Wally Lamb has written, "The seeker embarks on a journey to find what he wants and discovers along the way what he needs." Everyone in here is already on their own personal journey. Some will follow the path of financial reward, and others will seek to fulfill intellectual curiosity, and others will choose a life of public service. But what I can say from my own experience, you must have the courage to wander. You must have the courage to take risks. You will make mistakes. You must be willing, as Robert Kennedy once said, to brave the disapproval of others and censor of your colleagues. I urge you to seek out and listen to those who will serve as your guides in life, but also remember the most important guide is yourself. Listen to your heart. Follow your passions. Follow your inner voice. What I've learned as I prepared for these remarks, is in addition to what I described as far as my own conquering of my demons, that my inner voice was about making our world better. It was about protecting those who can't protect themselves. It's about safeguarding the helpless. Each of you has the opportunity to change the world, but each of you must find your own calling. So after 31 years, I have arrived where I needed to be. My journey certainly wasn't easy, nor was it always clear that I was on the right path. But in the end, the road I traveled was the right one. It provided me with the experiences I needed to play my role at this point in history. So I'll leave you with one final thought, because my thing's blinking. In the end, there are many paths each of you can follow. But the one that you ultimately take is less important than where you end up at the conclusion of your journey. Thank you.